Hi, this is on the road to understanding, or as I call it, thoughts less traveled. When you think of Gandhi, who do you think of? I think of civil rights, non-cooperation, even though it predates him, the peaceful revolution in India, relatively, and Indian independence. And those are all good things to think about. They're all substantial accomplishments in the man's life, but they're a caricature of who he really was. There's a lot more to him than that. When you think of his views on India, he was into non-partitions, and this was actually his views of the world. When India got their independence, he didn't want to break off Pakistan and Bangladesh. They should be forced to live together. It didn't matter that the Muslims and the Hindus would have fought for 50 or 100 years. All those lives lost weren't as important as his philosophy. Make them live together. The same with Israel and other places around the world. When it came to World War II and Hitler, he thought we should leave Hitler alone. He didn't like what was going on, but war was never the answer to him. He thought the Jews should protest what Hitler was doing in the internment camps by killing themselves. They should throw themselves off cliffs and kill themselves with butcher knives, if that's what it took to really teach Hitler a lesson. Gandhi was a bit of a racist in his early life. When he was imprisoned with the South Africans, he came out and said some things about how Indians were above them and so on. We don't know if in his mid-years or later years, if he actually revised his views or he just learned to shut up about them, because he didn't say much later on that was that bad. And his political or philosophical movement of Swaraj was that when India got its independence, he didn't think they should be set up as a parliamentary centralized government. That was just Little England to him. He thought they should think bigger, and they should govern themselves by all the little towns having communes. They would share all their resources. They would all work together and vote together, and they'd all vote for this common good, but there'd be no real central authority. It would just kind of work by magic and singing Kumbaya and stuff. And Gandhi was a bit of a womanizer in his private life. And this is all not to denigrate the man. It's to understand the whole man. He was a lot more than the character we built. When we think of Martin Luther King, it's very similar. We have this popular image that he was a civil rights leader. He ended segregation. He was inspired by the Quakers and Gandhi. And he still delivered one of the most powerful lines in all of recorded history. I'm sorry, and I Have a Dream speech, hearing that line, you're just instantly bonded to his plight or his cause. The rest of the speech got a little rambly, but it's still very, very powerful. And again, not to denigrate the man in any way or lessen his accomplishments, but to understand him, you have to understand a lot more than that. He was a bit of a hypocrite. While he said we shouldn't be judged by the color of the skin, the first thing he wanted to do was judge people by the color of their skin. He wanted $50 billion to all blacks, given by all whites. It didn't matter that the slave trade couldn't have existed without the aids of blacks in Africa, or that many blacks held slaves, most whites did not. In fact, the majority of the population had come in after 1860s and the Civil War was over, where many whites sacrificed their lives to free blacks. All that wasn't as important. He just wanted to judge people by the color of the skin and give them money for past wrongs. When it came to Vietnam, 6 million South Asians dying was not his particular concern. It wasn't his fight. Let him go. He was a bit of, he wasn't necessarily a communist, we don't know, but we know that his top leadership had ties to the communist and or socialist parties. Martin Luther King was an adulterer and a hypocrite. And if you think about what he really did, he was a pastor. And what do pastors do? They find common or inspirational things that are happening in society, and they get out there and speak on them to promote people to their point of view. And he did that. He did that brilliantly. But he was doing his job. Again, this isn't to denigrate the man in any way. He deserves the positive parts of his reputation, but we also deserve to honor him enough to remember the whole man, not just the character. And I'm going somewhere with all this. When you think of Tiananmen Square, who do you think of? Most people think of Tank Man. That was the young student that stood in front of the tanks and got them to stop. They don't tend to think of the 500 dead or the 5,000 wounded. The reason we'll always know him as Tank Man is because he was hauled off by the Chinese police, shot, and buried in an anonymous grave, so we'll never know who he was. Which is important to know because for each Gandhi or Martin Luther King out there, there's probably 1 million dead anonymous martyrs who we'll never know their names of. Think about these leaders, and what do you think of? I think of roughly 1 million dead each to enter their little club. Now, it's not true for all of them. There's a few of them that just would have rather had 1 million dead, but weren't able to affect that kind of change. But it still gives you a little point. So what's the difference between a Gandhi, an MLK, and all the anonymous dead martyrs? And a lot of it is who they chose and when they chose to oppose them. Gandhi chose the British Empire. Ultimately, it may have taken a little while, but he was able to shame them. They were forced into making a decision of keeping their money and power and empire, or giving all that up because their morals were worth more to them. They didn't want to be the oppressors. And the British made the right decision. The same with Martin Luther King. He chose the Americans. If he had chose that in 1860, he would have been strung up and we would have never known his name. But he chose the US in the 1960s. If all 14% of blacks at the time had been for it, for civil rights and in this way, which of course they weren't, it wouldn't have mattered because the 86%, if the 86% had been against it, they would have crushed him as they had done in the past. But he chose a time and a location where the Americans were forced to shame themselves or to think about the shames that it would have taken to keep the blacks oppressed at the time. And they couldn't live with that. And so we got a very positive change because of him. But instead of just celebrating the leader, I think we should celebrate what the society did. The reason for this is, as JFK said, the greatest enemy of the truth isn't the lie, it's the myth. It's how you erode the truth until you can no longer recognize it. And that brings me to the conclusion. A lot of people think of Tank Man. He stood out there and stood in front of the tanks, but he was just a young, dumb kid that got himself killed. Now think a tank driver. He's a guy who has honor, a duty to his country, an obligation to his job and his fellow army men to run this guy over. He's the one that's forced to make the decision. And he chose personal sacrifice and his morals over all those other things. He chose to stop the tank, even though it probably hurt him in his career and he paid all the personal prices. Instead of celebrating Tank Man, I think we, in the future, and in this case, we should celebrate Tank Driver and the tank drivers of the world. Anyways, thank you for your time. I hope this just makes you think of things a little differently.